We are back, this time with tea. Technically, this is not tea. Technically, this is, you can see it. This is an immune boosting concoction that cooked all night. It's actually very, very good. Lots of good stuff in here. So, self-forgiveness video 2. If you are here, then I can only assume, we know how dangerous that can be, that you made your list of what you're blaming yourself for, and that you might have even gotten poked by some things on that list, or by your thoughts about the things on that list. Because remember, if we're doing our truth work, we aren't getting poked by the things on the list. We are poked by our thoughts about the things on the list. There's a difference. So, if you made your list, then you've started to see some things, started to maybe have some pieces fall into place and see how you're taking responsibility for things in your life that are simply not yours. How my husband is being in life has nothing to do with me. How someone is acting at work has nothing to do with me. How someone reacts to me has nothing to do with me, but if I'm taking responsibility for that, taking it personally, and then blaming myself for the situation, that's on me. Okay? So look over your list. If you have it in front of you, look over it. If you don't have it in front of you, pause the video. Go grab it. Okay? That's my pause with and for you. Okay? Look over your list and pick, we'll say 1 to 3, depending on how many you have on your list. If you only have 3 or 4 things on your list, then pick 1. If you have 10, pick 2. If you have several, pick 3 or so. You can always go back to each thing on the list, but if you do have a longer list, it can be a little better to, not necessarily better, it can be less overwhelming. Let's stay in truth. It can be less overwhelming for you if you pick the ones that are hottest. So look over your list and which ones had the most chatter. Which ones, when you looked at blaming yourself for it, your ego, your mind chatter reacted and resisted the thought that you're not to blame. There's one on there, you're like, nope, I'm to blame. Or if you really got hot or flushed or had a physical response in some way. So remember from our forgiveness work, if you're being triggered in any way, if you're reacting in any way, you've not forgiven. So if some of those triggers came up here, if some of those reactions came up here, which ones were the hottest? Which ones had the quickest, the hardest, the most abrupt, the most in-depth reactions? And pick those few. So those are the ones you're going to work on for the next piece. Big inhale. And instead of doing a second video on one of these pieces, I'm going to combine them. They're similar, but they're different. So part 1 of the next step is to look at those that you chose, those few. My nose is itching so badly with this dry air. What are you blaming yourself for? Which one's hot? How are you punishing yourself? So choose one, work on it, then choose another after you've worked on the one. So how are you punishing yourself for what you're blaming yourself for? And be very honest with yourself about this, all right? Be really honest with yourself about this. How's your health? How are you punishing yourself health-wise? How are you punishing yourself sleep-wise? Are you giving yourself enough sleep? Are you depriving yourself of sleep, and that is a subconscious or an unconscious punishment? Are you oversleeping? Are you avoiding by just going to sleep and forget about it, and then you feel very tired and lethargic and heavy, and you're not getting things done, especially the things that you want to do. You're letting your goals go. That could be a way you're punishing yourself. You won't even let yourself have your goals. That's where Kermit the Frog comes in again. That was one that was big for me. Several years ago, there were things that I wanted to do, and even as I start saying this, another piece of it came up. See this eyebrow? It's always fun for me, and I do mean that. It's still pokey, but when I'm doing a video or I'm doing a talk and something comes up for me, a truth comes up, a realization comes up, but I'm in the middle of doing the talk, and so I can't really respond to it. The cool thing about these videos is that I think you guys like it when I can do that, because it gives you real world examples. So something that just came to me, I think I probably touched on, but it just came very clear what I was going to say. Anticipation. What I was going to say is that several years ago, I had some projects that I was working on in big ways. I had goals. I was striving for them. Now, one of the things that I came to was, before that, in 2 or 3 years before this occurred, was that my goals were not what I thought they were. That I was going after some of these things, but I was actually trying to prove my worth through them. And when I realized that, and did a whole lot of work on it, I was able to let it go. And by letting it go, I was then able to look at it from a different perspective and a different light. And I started going forward with some of the things. But then a change occurred in my life. Now, the change occurred right on the coattails of another significant change. My husband's downward spiral and eventual admission into a year-long rehab program 2 hours away. So I had been doing the circuit for a while with poetry readings and performances. I was writing a lot. I was selling a lot of my books. I was really going forward with that of, okay, we've got forward motion here. I was putting together my own poetry readings. I created an artist gathering place, so to speak, an artist community thing here in Athens with a friend of mine. We created porch poetry. People from all around traveled to this. We created an art walk, an art show, where we had poets and we had singers and entertainers and people setting up their art exhibits and their art tents. It was a beautiful experience. And right after that, things changed. So my husband kind of went downhill, and unbeknownst to me, I went downhill with him as well, just in a different way. I stopped everything poetry. When he, I'm telling a story. This was before rehab. This was actually when we separated. Sometimes you have to think about the timeline. This was before that, so scratch out everything I said about rehab. That is not true to this story. It did happen, but not in this timeline. This was actually when we separated. He was on a much smaller downward spiral than I knew was going to come later. We separated, and we actually divorced. And on the coattails of that, I shut down. I stopped, for a long time, I stopped going out and doing any readings except for the ones that I already had scheduled. And even then, I really only gave enough to get through. I wasn't writing anything new. I resisted it. I certainly wasn't working on any books or working to publish anything new. And then, because it always seems like a good idea, I started dating someone that I had dated before who had treated me without respect. We'll say that. And it was very different that go round, and I learned a lot. I also dropped a lot of weight. I was not taking care of myself. I was not eating. I stopped school. I put my thesis on hold indefinitely. I did do a little bit more poetry reading at about the 6-month mark. I got back into it a little bit, but it wasn't the truth of me. It was very ego-led. If I was on stage and people were watching me, then I mattered. I was something. They were listening to me. If they were clapping, if they were telling me, my God, you just spoke to me, then I had a purpose in this world. And even that was a little bit short-lived, clearly. And this was also around the time that I was approached about the teacher training. And I resisted it. I said, absolutely not. But in that coming year, I agreed. And I put everything else on hold for that. One of the things I've said recently is that in some ways it feels like my life has gone in rewind, but in actuality I'm kind of picking up where I left off in a different way. I have so much more experience now. But what hit me a few minutes ago, that was that in the moment, oh shit thing, was that as much as I loved it and as much as I learned and am incredibly grateful, in some ways, saying yes and staying in and pushing myself so hard with the teacher training was a form of self-punishment. How about that? So what are you saying yes to that's actually a way for you to punish yourself? That's actually a way for you to turn your back on your hopes and dreams and your purpose. What are cross purposes in your life that are actually little acts of punishment? So that's the deeper version of how are you punishing yourself. Some of the more surface level could be actual self-punishment if you're self-harming in any way. And I'm doing this because people will cut, but I mean self-harm could be overeating, it could be undereating, it could be abusing or overusing drugs, alcohol, sex, television, whatever it is. Social media. I took a 2.5-hour bath where I was going to be flipping through a book. I did not. Instead, I just scrolled, looking at nothing. Okay? So how are you punishing yourself? That is part 2A. And 2B is, how are you seeking revenge? And one of the questions in class was, aren't those the same thing? I don't believe that they are. So one is an obvious, you are punishing yourself. It's a little bit more straightforward. Seeking revenge comes with this calculated thought process of, I'll get you. I'm going to find a way to sabotage you. I'm going to find a way to get you back for what you've done. So some things to think about. Big inhale. Thank you for being with me for another video and listening to a little bit of my story as I figured out a little bit of an aha for myself. And if you find out one of those ahas for you, please comment. You know, talk to the group, talk to me, talk to us. We're here together. You matter. This work is worth it because you are important. Go look and see how you're punishing yourself.